Well, thank you so much for turning up here today. I do appreciate it. And that despite this turbulent, tumultuous weather outside, which sort of blew me in the general direction of the Commons. I don't know now what to say after that very kind Norma and rich introduction. And of course the fact that you are here, which is a kindness, an ineffable kindness, the kind of kindness that one doesn't find words for. So simply to say thank you is probably the best I'm going to be able to muster right now. And I would say, Rich, you know, when I packed my bag this morning and I saw how kindly and mindfully and carefully you had wound up my power cable when we left the last time, you know, it sounds like a small thing, but it is the small things in life that often demonstrate and show character. And in that spirit, thank you so much for your kind words and your kindness. So it doesn't go unnoticed.
Engineers have a need for order. I'm serious. That's not. We have a need for order.
Check his desk at home.
Yeah.
Create order.
Yeah.
I have a way that I do almost everything.
It's the engineer in you. Well, I would venture to say it's the human being in you too, and it's the heart as much as the engineering mind, and I thank you for that. It's obvious that I have no idea where to start, and that's always a good way for me to start because it helps me get going, to reflect on that, and so we are going to talk today about this question of reparations. I think I did say that I would end on that topic, and I hardly need tell you that it is hardly an end, but perhaps just the beginning of more questions rather than anything else. I also, without wanting to go into the trust feed massacre and the film you saw about Mitchell, want to say that I tried to Google a little bit more about him because I think one of the questions was what had happened after he had been there, etc. I couldn't find very many references, and one might think that might be something you want to put out there more, is what were the results of events like that. You might think that would be a healthy thing to do in the context of truth and reconciliation. But the references I did find were to two books, one called Restorative Justice Today, Practical Applications by Lorraine Walker, and the other one called Forgiveness and Power in the Age of Atrocity, Servant Leadership as a Way of Life by Shan Ray Furch. And both of these seem to make reference to the fact that Mitchell had indeed stayed involved in that community and had been involved in fundraising internationally and also helped to build a community center there. So the sparse references that I could find to follow up, and I offer those to you sort of by way of small closure now in relation to that specific case study. Right, so where do I want to start? Well, why don't we start with some words? What is it that we're going to be and have been talking about? And as I say that, I realize I've made them so small here that I can't read them, even with my glasses on. And I also realize that I left an email behind which I wanted to refer to today, but I'll try my best to do that from memory. Words like transition, words like gratuitous and irrational violence, words like systemic and widespread gross human rights abuses, words like amnesty, words like reparations, which we're going to talk about today, justice, truth. Remember that old chestnut hybridity, messiness, confusion, contradiction, unease, consensus, closure, catharsis, forgiveness, healing, hatred, revenge, memory, amnesia, forgetfulness, criminal trials, and this one that probably we will leave together always pondering, which is this feeling of simultaneously feeling contradictory emotions, which I do believe I suggested characterized transitions, and I do believe characterized some of also the viewing, and indeed the content probably, in relation to how one feels about things like that. How's that for a summary, and do you have words that you might add? Because I sort of 5-ish this morning pulled together a list of words that I thought, sort of covered generally the kinds of things that we're speaking about. So I offer those to you by way of reminder. We revisit them by way of backdrop, by way of thinking perhaps about reparations too, and truth and reconciliation in the broader sense. Now, before I get into a critical perspective on reparations in South Africa, I again want to emphasize just how amazing it was that we actually had that Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I don't want a critical stance towards reparations in the TRC to mitigate against what might now come across as a particularly critical perspective on reparations. So I say that by way of caveat. And the other thing I'd like to do for 2 or 3 minutes is to globally contextualize reparations. Yeah. And I do that again by, what did we do before we had Google? I don't know. When my son or my daughter ask me a question, I say, I don't know, but let's Google it. In class, students will Google something, and there we have answers on tap. Now, it's a different question as to the veracity of those answers. And of course, I don't allow Wikipedia as a source, a bibliographic source, But that aside, you do get a good sense of some of the answers. And so I Googled the word reparations. Isn't it so sad that someone sits somewhere behind a computer and Googles the word reparations? Yet it's what I did. I came up with a Washington Post article. 11th of March this year, it was written. Chris Van Hollen, ring a bell? Yeah. Become one of the most prominent members of your Congress, I believe, in recent history to suggest legislation to potentially make provision for reparations for slavery. And so the Washington Post, because of the sensitivity of this issue, and I feel I should say this too, says, and I quote, "To reiterate and be completely clear, Van Hollen is saying he'd be open to considering a bill that considers reparations." And so in Googling this word reparations, I found that Representative John Conyers, perhaps another, I may mispronounce that name, introduces legislation every year since 1989 to set up a 7-person committee to consider the idea of reparations. Apparently this bill has a name, H.R. 40. And the name, I'm told, is because former slaves would receive 40 acres and a mule. Yeah, so H.R. 40. That's where it derives its name from. The thing is, it doesn't seem to have any support. So obviously, it's introduced every year and it goes nowhere every year. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa, and indeed the United States of America, we are not alone. Far from alone. A survey of the International Center for Transitional Justice website, and I have the link for you, and when I give this documentation, if you want to click on that, you will find this website, has examples on its website dedicated to reparations. And it includes the following four. The Chilean government, paid more than $1.6 billion in pensions to certain victims of the Pinochet regime. Established a special health care program for survivors. And there was an official apology from the president. The Moroccan government is currently implementing, as a result of its commission, individual and community-based reparations programs for the 50 years of what was the so-called lead years in Morocco. In 2010, the president of Sierra Leone formally apologized to women. Now, let's not ask why he had to apologize to women, or should we? For his country's 10-year armed conflict. And of course we should, by the way. That's, and so there's an apology combined with modest compensation. And in Cambodia, its fourth example, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia have ordered symbolic and collective reparations in the court's first convictions for abuses, for human rights abuses. Indeed, the court has ordered the publication of the names of victims of a notorious prison, that these be listed on the court's website, and certainly apologies have to be issued, or required to be issued, by those who are convicted. We're just contextualizing reparations. That's all we're doing here. And we're beginning to see that South Africa isn't alone. The United States Institute of Peace has a digital collection, a Truth Commission digital collection. I don't know how to feel about these things, that we have these collections and that we have these things. I'm starting to feel mixed up again. I don't know if you are. But I certainly am, and of course we need them, and of course we have them. And this collection, I mean, you can't see it and I can't see it, but the simple point is, and it's not complete, it's by no means complete, has links to a whole range of truth and reconciliation commissions and reparations regimes and approaches and processes and documents and so forth. And those countries go from A to what you call Z and I call Z, Argentina through Zimbabwe. And so you can see that if I give you a context, then it is indeed that much broader, much wider picture that I would like to paint, and which I would like to situate and contextualize the South African experience. Because I certainly don't want to leave the impression that South Africa had a TRC and South Africa tried reparations and that we were the only ones. And that indeed there is a whole range of experience around this. Now, just to close this small section on context, there is a person by the name of Ruti Title, whom I'm increasingly beginning to realize is one of the visionary thinkers of our time. And I say that because she places transitions in millennial context. And if I can, and if there's time at the end, I want to talk about the times, the nature of the times that we are living in. Because she makes certain comments about that, which have helped open my mind to the big picture, if you like. But Ruti Title published an article in the Harvard Human Rights Journal, volume 16, in fact. And she talks about 3 developmental phases for all of this. And the first phase that she identifies is the post-1945 phase, the post-war phase, that she talks about Allied-run Nuremberg trials as for the first time putting transitional justice on the map in the context also of international law. And that's the first step, or the first phase, if you like, in the development of, amongst other things, reparations and truth commissions. And so you can see the kind of reparations spoken about there, Nuremberg trials. Phase 2, the second phase, is associated with what she terms the accelerated democratization and political fragmentation that occurred with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent, if you like, transitions or concurrent transitions in South America, in Eastern Europe, and also in many countries on the African continent. And here's the third phase, and you know, if there is time, and I don't know how I'm going to do for time, and so I'm a little bit nervous about the end, because there is no end, but I do need to end somewhere. And I do want to try and end on this bigger picture if I can, is the wording here is kind of interesting, because she talks about phase 3 as being a steady state phase. And by steady state, she's referring to transitional justice as a steady state. The transitional justice becoming normative, truth and reconciliation commissions becoming a normal feature of the global political landscape. Now we have to think very carefully about what that means, ladies and gentlemen. And if I can at the end, I want to talk a little bit about the normalization, the steady state nature of the absurd, of the irrational, of the shocking. Because that's in effect, if we're saying this is how we're going to do business, and it's okay to have a normalized, if it's okay to have a political landscape that normalizes transitional justice, what are we saying? Yeah? And we can say the same about ideal conceptions of justice versus political power, and what the implications are if we're saying it's okay to bend justice, and how far do we bend it in the interests of reconciliation and national unity, and what does that mean long term and in the big picture? I'm running ahead of myself. Let me simply say that Ruti title talks about transitional justice moving from the exception, and I quote, to the norm, to in fact become a paradigm of the rule of law. So we need to think about what that means. Yeah? Let's see if we can get there. Let's see if I can manage the time to get there. Righty-ho, let's start with South Africa. Here we go. Here we go. And in many respects, you know the current picture. You know the current circumstances. Do you want me to use that? Do you like it because I've got this on the slides? Yeah? I can do that. Yeah. I think. But you won't be able to see it. I think that's probably why I'm shy to use it. Yeah? I read to you the letter by Kulumani, and you know that we are dissatisfied with reparations. You know that in the context of that letter that I read you, we do not have a satisfactory state in relation to reparations. And you know that there is unease and that we've problematized, if you like, reparations. In 2003, on the 3rd of June 2003, the Justice and Constitutional Development Portfolio Committee began to deal with the final recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in relation to reparations. And the press release, which I've taken from a newspaper article, page 2 of the Mercury, dated the 2nd of June 2003, spoke about the fact that the interim reparations phase had been completed, except for 1,000 victims, their words, who could not be traced by either the TRC or the government. And so interim reparations had been paid to 17,040 victims to the value of just under 50 million South African rands.
How much
divide it by 10. I'm hoping on Monday when I go to South Africa that the exchange rate will be better. But I use a rule of thumb when I'm there, and I just divide it by 10, and so you get, 5 million. Is that right? I wish it was wrong. Right, and so that second paragraph there is as clumsy as the process, because the process in effect was bureaucratized. And so the recommendations that the TRC made went to Parliament. They were tabled in Parliament a little earlier, and if you begin to read that, you begin to see just how governments can bureaucratize things. In accordance with Section 27 of the Act, a joint committee of Parliament shall make final recommendations, which recommendations, when approved by Parliament, will enable the President to make regulations. And it notes there that we are now awaiting this phase to be, completed. Thereafter, of course, more regulations need to be developed, is what the next one says. Now, really, in effect, what we're saying is there was money for reparations. There was actually much more money. There was 976 million rands. That's, again, $97 million in the President's Fund, which could have also been disbursed, which was earmarked for that, which wasn't disbursed, which wasn't spent. And so the rest of my commentary here, and I really do apologize because these were not meant to be displayed. So in your feedback, please be kind when it comes to these things, because they are literally notes for me rather than meant to be seen. So the bureaucratization of this process is evident, yeah? And resulting from that is a catatonia, yeah, which persists to this day. That's really the key point there. Excepting to say that already in these early days, Kulumani was already saying, this isn't enough. This is not enough. And in fact went on to sue foreign banks and foreign companies for their cooperation with the apartheid state. Now, all of that was thrown out, including stuff that happened here in your country with some of the American companies that were active during apartheid in South Africa. But this last paragraph there is, of course, an interesting one. These committees that are set up, so this particular committee that would be looking at reparations and so forth, in the press release says it would be likely to deal with another draft bill being prepared by the Justice Department on the immunity process for perpetrators who had failed to participate in the TRC. Can you even believe that sentence? Mbeki, the president at the time, said the government had decided against a general amnesty, thank heavens, because it would fly in the face of the TRC's efforts to establish accountability. Yet, and I quote, we also have to deal with the reality that many of the participants in the conflicts of the past did not take part in the TRC process. Right. So where do we stand today? Well, we know that there is an obligation upon states to provide reparations, to provide individual reparations for victims of gross human rights abuses. And we know that that, in fact, is well established in international law. And if I have a moment, I'll canter through 3 or 4 international law instruments just to give you a sense of the extent to which it is embedded in international law. We also know that the TRC's Reparations and Rehabilitation Committee, abbreviated to RRC, the Reparations and Rehabilitation Committee was tasked with designing a comprehensive reparations policy. It was mandated by the Act to design such a reparations policy. And we also know that the RRC recommended providing interim urgent reparation and longer-term reparation, as well as symbolic reparations, and certainly also legal and administrative reparations to ensure also institutional reform. We know that these recommendations were included in the final report, because you can go and get the report and you can go and see these recommendations. And I think I would urge you, and I'll give you the exact reference in a moment, I would urge you to go and have a look at those. If there's anything you read, have a look at what the TRC recommended. We know as well that the reparations subcommittee, and indeed the committee itself, the commission itself, lacked the ability to enforce and implement any of these recommendations. We know that. It could only make recommendations to government, which is why it tabled that, and which is why what happened in 2003 in Parliament happened. That was the process. The implementation remained dependent on the political will of the government. So here again you see that hybridity, the political will versus an ideal, insofar as it can be ideal, an ideal recommendation, and what happens in the context of political will. Now, Kulumani, if you go to their website, and I've got the link, that blue bit, I learned how to do what's called hyperlinks. So inside that word is a. If you click on it, you go to the website. It's like magic. Isaac Newton thought gravity was magic, and we still don't know how it works, by the way. So, it might as well be magic. Except to say, of course, if you don't know something, there's no shame in saying, I don't know. And that's quite profound, rather than saying, oh, it's that, which is, of course, a complete guess and fabrication, if you don't know. So Kulumani tells us, and Rich, I am going to spend an hour talking about nothing, by the way, because Rich and I were talking about topics, and I said, well, I want to spend an hour talking about nothing, and Rich said, well, that's not possible. You can't, and he's right. Of course, he's right. Accepting that I have a certain idea that I want to talk about. Binary thinking, the pernicious nature of binary thinking, the fact that the Greeks, we should have listened to the ancient Greeks, because in some respects, thinking about things like black and white, and my favorite one, which is something and nothing, has led us on a wild goose chase for so long. And so we should talk about nothing, because we don't want to stay on that wild goose chase. There is no such thing as nothing. It's tautological. It undermines itself. If you just think about the concept, it can't exist. So how can you talk about something that can't exist? Of all the countries that have implemented reparations, South Africa is the only one that has restricted the number of recipients to those registered on the TRC. That's the closed list idea, more broadly saying, end date, no more reparations. Those folk are in, and that's the end of the story. We're the only one who's done that. In every other case, the registration process has continued post-TRC, or whatever it was called. After the conclusion of a commission's work, in order to provide everyone the opportunity to come forward and to talk about and be able to qualify for compensation. So in South Africa's case, you had that limitation on the number. You had certain folk that couldn't be found, 1,000 to 2,000 of those. And certainly the estimates, 3,000, 4,000, depending on the exchange rate. A one-off payment was paid out to 15,000 plus people in the context of what is, and again here I got stuck because one has to refer to this so often, I guess, that one uses another acronym, Urgent Interim Reparation, UIR. Well, there you go. Now, Kulumani is clear on this, and you may agree, and you may want to measure it up against what international law says, is that the one-off payment, the one-off UIR payment, did not reflect the recommendations put forward by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nor was it sufficient to meet the needs of those that needed and deserved reparation. Nor was it paid to everyone that was even identified in the closed process. Yeah. And for Kulumani, it means that up to 2,000 victims as of today, and this is live on their website right now, so this is current. Yeah. Up to 2,000 folk who were identified by the TRC have yet to receive compensation. Never mind the 60,000, I think, is a figure on their website, and there might be more, that ought to be have access to compensation. Now, also on their website, on the 29th of November 2013, the Department of Justice, which has responsibility for reparations and for continuing the work of the TRC, has said that they publish a general notice 1178 in a government gazette. I don't read the government gazette in South Africa, and I'm a South African. I don't know if you read the government gazette in South Africa. I don't think there's any reason why you would. But the point, of course, there is who reads the government gazette? And what it's saying, of course, is that there was no effort to then say that there's this general notice, there are new regulations relating to community reparations. Folk, can you give us your thoughts, etc., etc. In sharp contradistinction, remember, to the genesis of the TRC itself under Mandela and Madiba's approach, yeah, to getting civil society involved in designing and establishing the TRC. Now we have this hardly transparent process which suggests there are going to be community reparations. Now, I'd have thought that that'd be kind of important for us as South Africans to be aware of and to celebrate and to get behind. Excepting to say, of course, that now you look at these regulations as Kulumani does, rightly does, and they provide for community reparation for 18 communities in South Africa. 18 communities selected, in its view, by undisclosed criteria, each to be allocated $3 million, 30 million rands, and wonderful, there's a 6% increase built into that. And apparently the nature of these projects include infrastructure development, school construction, school improvement, health and social services, skills development support. You might think, well, okay, 18 communities, and those things sound laudable and wonderful, excepting to say that I happen to agree with Kulumani that that's the job of the government anyway. Since when did you need special reparations processes to do what they should be doing anyway? And so they refer to this as reparations in disguise. Where is their sentence? I can't see it here now. But they do refer to it as disguised reparations, because in actual fact, surely that is what a government should be doing. I listened to President Obama on C-SPAN talking about water in Flint, and he was talking about one of your first Republican presidents asking about what the state should do and what the individual should do, and whose responsibility is it to do what. And he was making points about, so who should provide water and who should provide roads, and who is responsible for infrastructure in a local community or indeed in a nation. And I have views on that, and I might add one more: who is responsible for providing healthcare? But that, of course, is a very controversial addition to that list. because it certainly is true that the state is responsible for the water. And there are some things folk can do together, and there's some things folk can do on their own. And it is that demarcation as to where you begin to move towards government as opposed to what you might do on your own. And certainly I can't put in water pipes for an entire Nashville. In any event, so you can see that from a South African perspective, what Kulumani is saying and what we're saying is that that's the job of government. So we don't accept that there's this 18 community approach and that it ought to be reparations, and that there's this 30 million. If you multiply 30 by 18, I didn't do that math, but do you get to the President's Fund $970 million? Rich, you're an engineer. I can't. Thank you, sir. 500. So you don't even get. You might get halfway, which of course means that the number on the President's Fund is woefully inadequate anyway, and that we should have more, but that we don't even get there. If you want to read about the reparations approach and policy and so forth, you will find it in volume 6, section 2 of the report, a 7-volume report. And if any of you do want to, that's the specific reference to where you'll find it. And I quickly summarized simply up there so that you can see it in case you haven't got the time to read the entire report. Some of what it covers. And so it does cover the case for reparation and rehabilitation. It does cover international and domestic law. It does talk about an argument for reparation emerging from comparative law and from customary law. It does talk about what witnesses to the TRC said about reparations. It does include the business sector view, the civil society view, and of course, if you do want to read just a few pages, I almost felt like reading only them here today, the concluding remarks, poignant, moving, profound, and my penultimate remarks today, if I get to them, might be we might end on those, because after all, what are we really talking about? You know, we are really talking about what value to place on human life. That's really what we're talking about, if you think about it. If you were a commissioner on that commission or on a commission, you would have had to face that question. You would have literally had to say, how do I answer that question? That would have been a job for you. And then if you think about it, the other question that you would have needed to address, which was also you had a statutory obligation to address this issue, is how do I prevent this from happening in the future? Why do people behave the way they do? Why did a collectivity of South Africans support apartheid? Why didn't they question it? And the third question, of course, is the normalization of transitional justice, which is a separate question. It's not a separate question per se, but it is not a question I necessarily want to go into. But I do want to touch on these other questions. I want to make it that real for you. You would have had to come up with some sort of reparations policy. What would your policy have looked like? What would it have included? How would you have designed it? How would you have gone about that? So the TRC draws out two cases for reparations, the moral case and the legal case or basis for reparations. The starting point for the TRC, of course, is the fact that there was such widespread human rights abuse. So in the context of human rights abuse, the argument is that people who have suffered that abuse have a right to reparation. Do they? this morning when I did wake up at 5 o'clock, I found an email in my inbox from the Institute of Transitional Justice, whatever they call themselves, the ICTJ, International Center for Transitional Justice. And I wish I'd brought it with because I wanted to read a bit from it. It said something like, I forget the subject line. Should we remember, or should we forget, or something to that effect? And then it said, "Dear Clive," and it went into a small preamble, and then it had photographs of two people, prominent scholars. And so the question is, does it do harm to remember? Does it do more harm to reconciliation to remember, or does it do more good to collectively remember? And you had these two scholars in their faces, and the one makes a yes argument and the one makes a no argument. And if you want to go read the yes and the no arguments, and I can share this with you if you like. So, you know, you feel that there should be reparation. I bet you when I stopped and said, should there be, you were probably, I hope you were thinking, yes, there should. Maybe you weren't. I don't know. You wouldn't be wrong if you were saying, no, there shouldn't. Because there are, and the debate even today continues as to whether it is important to remember, what is the impact of remembering, what are the impacts of processes like this, and so forth. But the case for reparations in our case is contained in our Constitution, it's contained in the Founding Act, and it's contained in the majority judgment of the Constitutional Court that I spoke about, the Azapo case. It's contained there as well. And I think I speak for South Africans when we say the vast majority of South Africans agree that there should be, so the moral case is there too. Yeah. Certainly, though, we do struggle with the idea of what constitutes adequate reparations. And here's where we probably find the real struggle. So over and above this debate as to whether or not there should be reparations, we also then say, well, if we say there are grounds for reparations, what should those be? And that question, together with the lemming-like behavior of certain human beings, are counterpoints for me, two sides of the same coin. We have lemming-like behavior. Why does that happen? We have reparations. What constitutes fair and adequate reparations? Right, so a moral case and a legal case. The international legal framework is important because South Africa signed up to a number of international legal instruments, and by being signatory to those instruments, of course, there was an automatic requirement legally that it comply, that it do something about that. Whether you answer yes or no to that question, the right of survivors of human rights abuse to fair and adequate compensation is in fact well established in international law. And if there's an international lawyer here, you know, you can help me out, because I'm not an international lawyer. I'm a political scientist. But certainly it is well established. And South Africa, as I say, is a signatory to a number of these international instruments, which placed it then under an obligation to comply with those international instruments. But certainly, if you review those international instruments, you will see that it is not enough simply to give token compensation. It has to be fair and it has to be adequate. Token or nominal compensation is not sufficient. The amount of reparation awarded generally in terms of these instruments must be sufficient to make meaningful and substantial impact in the lives of those who qualify for it. This is true in terms of the United Nations conventions. It's a well-established right for survivors to compensation. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one of those. Article 8 talks about everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunal for acts violating the fundamental rights granted him. I apologize for the sexist language there. Perhaps we'll have enlightened drafters at some point. I don't know. So for acts violating fundamental rights granted them by the Constitution or by law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has similar language. The Convention Against Torture, other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment has similar language. And indeed, you also have the Inter-American Conventions on Human Rights, and I've summarized all of those there as well. All of these have an impact on the argument, also the legal argument, but certainly morals and ethics are bound up in that as to the yes answer to reparations and remembering. Now, I don't think anyone can anymore deny that millions, the TRC talks about thousands, but I talk about millions of casualties, killed, tortured, abducted, treated badly. And I don't think anybody can anymore deny that not only were individual lives destroyed, trust feed, communities were destroyed, families were destroyed, a whole nation was destroyed by apartheid. And certainly the TRC recognizes that hundreds of thousands of people, that the new government inherited hundreds of thousands of people who had had this significantly traumatic experience. And what the TRC was saying is, over and above these legal arguments, there is also a moral argument to, if you like, ensure that those whose rights have been violated, that they receive reparation and rehabilitation. Now, here's the thing, because we can be quick to criticize the TRC, and often it is felt that by placing a certain monetary amount, that the TRC didn't understand the value of human life. But the TRC wrote this in its report. While such measures, speaking about reparations, while such measures can never bring back the dead or adequately compensate for pain and suffering, they can and must improve the quality of life of victims of human rights violations and their dependents. So the TRC itself recognized that moral dilemma. It recognized that the Archbishop as chair and the commissioners and the subcommittee that had this very difficult task of defining a policy for reparations had to operate within that context. How on earth would they do it if we accept that it itself recognized that we can't bring back the dead, we can't compensate adequately for the loss of brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and so forth. Yet it had that task. Yeah? Not only did it have that task, it was demanded of it that it come up statutorily on the one hand, but certainly popularly on the other. Yeah? And I'll talk about a survey which it conducted the TRC conducted in a moment. Not only this, but it also said that the government that came into power was morally obliged to accept the responsibility of the state and carry the burden of the state as it moved from the past into the future. So, in effect, that obligated the new government to pay for the sins of the past government. So we're saying the state needs to compensate survivors. And indeed, that was recognized by the Act and recognized by South Africans, that the state had that obligation. Here's the other thing that the TRC said, and again, there's a yes and a no. It said that without adequate reparation and rehabilitation, there could be no truth and reconciliation. It linked the two together. It said, you can't do the one without the other. You may differ, you may agree. And it said it wouldn't be possible to do that at the individual or the community level. Comprehensive forms of reparation, in its words, should be implemented also to restore the physical and mental well-being of individuals. Now let me see All right. I don't have any more time. Let me try and summarize because I want to move on to, I've only got 7 or 8 more minutes and then we want to do some Q&A. Do you have questions? Is there a reasonable number? There are some, I don't want to take them now, I just want to get a sense of how much time I might steal. There are some questions, okay, so we'll try and stick with the 15 minutes. So the reparations policy, the reparations regime, the architectural design criteria, if you like, the things that it said the package of reparations should live up to. These are described in detail in the report, and they're included in those recommendations that were made to government in 2003. And I might say that if you go and look at that reparations package, which I don't now have time to describe, you will probably see a reasonable proposal. I mean, it's not going to satisfy you. It's not going to satisfy anyone. But insofar as it can satisfy anyone, yeah, it's I think a reasonable proposal. And the fact is, we haven't lived up to it. The kinds of things it also surveyed, the TRC also surveyed people who came to the TRC to ask them, what do you want? Now, what was on top of that list? What was number 1 on that list? A monetary grant. Most folk wanted money. So most folk who came to the TRC wanted money. The analysis of a representative sample of statements revealed, and this is contained in Figure RR1, Volume 5, Chapter 5 of the TRC report. They wanted money for services or money. Money or services that money can buy. So the highest expectation was for money. 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th on that list, you should immediately wonder why I skipped 2. Bursaries, shelter, medical care. 6th was tombstones. Yeah, 6th was tombstones. So first was money. 3, bursaries. So that's money for school. So that's a scholarship. I think you call it, so we call it differently than you do. So if I give you a bursary, I'm paying for you to go and get educated or something. Grants, yeah, grants. Then shelter, so housing. Many folk didn't have. That lady had to go live in the mountains. We heard her talking at the trust feed. Medical care. 6th was tombstones. What was 2nd? What was number 2 on the list? Yes, ma'am. Almost. I really think that's so close. That acknowledgement gets me almost there, in fact, because they wanted to know, they wanted investigations to reveal the truth. So I would say that that's pretty close, in fact, to 2nd on that list was they wanted to know what happened. They didn't want money necessarily. They didn't want all those other things. Of course, they wanted all those things. But, 2nd on the list was, I want to know what happened. And, of course, in that respect, you can see how important the TRC really was. Because one of its contributions, besides helping us normalize democratic values, i.e., you have a right to exist, you have a right to air your voice, come into this process, we want to hear you, we want you to participate, very sharply opposed to the past, where people were told they were subhuman because they were black, is this question of telling the truth, which we now have. Right, I only have 5 more minutes. So there were a bunch of criteria. I would suggest there was a reasonable policy, insofar as it can be called reasonable. It was put forward to government. It hasn't been implemented for as long as the years have passed since 2003. The question of restorative justice sat at the heart also of of the TRC, and I would be remiss in not saying that if you think about Nelson Mandela coming out of jail and not having a single hair on his head that was a hair of revenge, a hair of retribution, and that indeed he came out and said, I want this thing, and I think this thing is going to help with reconciliation, and my agenda for my presidency is reconciliation. We have to say, of course, that we owe a huge thank you to Nelson Mandela, and that this is part of his legacy, that he helped also channel not just black anger, but also white opposition in favor of unifying us around things like this TRC, single-handedly, you know. So I do need to talk, and I would have liked to speak more about that icon and his legacy and role in relation to the TRC, and in particular in relation to Ubuntu and restorative justice. And I quote from his, let me just quote from his biography. Anthony Sampson was his official biographer, and Sampson wrote of Mandela as he moved towards his release. And whereas Mandela once channeled the raw hurt and anger of black people into the more controlled activities of Umkhonto we Sizwe and the broader liberation struggle, he was, when leaving jail, able to channel the raw hurt, anger, despair, and hopelessness of an entire nation into a mood of reconciliation rather than retribution. And I do want to credit Archbishop Desmond Tutu as well. You know, it's so no one can live in Mandela's shadow. It's impossible for us South Africans. You know, he's so big. But I know what he would say now. He would say, stop speaking rubbish because it was all South Africans and not me. That's how he was. Right. So I'm out of time. I'm going to steal 5 minutes of your time. Is that okay? All right, so we had amnesty. We had, as a counterbalance, reparations. You can see how skewed that was. We had the question of the state accepting that it needed to provide reparations, but then being very slow about this question of reparations. The question of limitations. The Commission had a mandate only to recommend, and the state, insofar as it can be exonerated or partially understood, had certainly a lack of capacity. So there certainly is a question of resource, and these things we have to accept if we think critically about the TRC. So those are caveats. Yeah? The Commission only had that power to place recommendations before the government. Now, if one thinks about what it really needed to do, then it needed to balance, if you like, amnesty against reparation. Yeah, and it didn't necessarily achieve that. I'm sorry, I'm pressing on the keyboard there, and I shouldn't be. Now, the Commission sought to identify both survivors and perpetrators, and it sought to find and walk that line between political accountability and an attribution, if you like, of moral responsibility. In that context, the Act was also talking about the importance of promoting national unity and reconciliation in a spirit that I described when I spoke about Mandela, in the spirit of understanding which transcends the conflicts and the divisions of the past. And it had to do that by establishing motives and trends and perspectives. And so for the TRC, without necessarily seeing, if you like, offender accountability as part of this quest for understanding, the uncovering, if you like, of motives. The potential certainly for an individualized, accountable amnesty process as a contribution to also the rehabilitation of perpetrators and the understanding that survivors sought, that this contribution to integrating everyone into a new society, this shouldn't be underestimated. This contribution shouldn't be underestimated. One of the Judge Muhammad at the time, spoke about opportunities to obtain relief from not only the atrocities, but also guilt and also anxiety, and for everyone to become an active member of our South African society. Everyone, all South Africans, were encouraged by the TRC to examine themselves and to examine their deeds. And certainly, when it came to apartheid, it was for every member of the white society to examine what they did. South Africa's weapons, ammunition, uniforms, vehicles, radios, all this equipment, they were all developed and provided by a massive industry, an international industry, not just a local one. South Africa's finances and banking were controlled to such an extent that covert credit cards were used for covert operations. Barclays Bank and all these others, I shouldn't name a bank, but white South African chaplains prayed for white South African victory. They prayed for that. South African schools and universities educated for war. The media carried the propaganda, the schools carried the propaganda, the enfranchised white community voted the former government back into power time and time again. So when we look at the TRC and we talk about moral accountability, we have to say that it goes much deeper than just legal and political accountability. We have to say individual and shared moral accountability is something that we have to think about and is something that unfortunately could not be adequately addressed by the TRC. The TRC, and I quote, said that what is required is that individuals and the community as a whole must recognize that the abdication of responsibility, the unquestioning obeying of commands, simply doing one's job. You heard that a lot of times at the TRC. I was simply doing my job. That guy that sat in the back of that Trojan horse thing, he said, well, I couldn't question it. I was simply doing my job. I had my shotgun and I shot a 12-year-old in the back. Submitting to the fear of punishment, moral indifference, the closing of one's eyes to simply permit oneself to be indeed intoxicated or seduced or bought by personal advantage. These are all essential parts of this multi-layered spiral of responsibility which makes large-scale systematic abuse, human rights violations possible in modern states. Those were the TRC's words. Only this realization, it said, can create the possibility for the emergence of something new in South Africa. What is required, in its view, is a moral and spiritual renaissance, which of course is a big deal, a big thing. Transformation of moral indifference, denial, paralyzing guilt, and unacknowledged shame we need to transform that into personal and social responsibility. And I end with this last one, which is that for the TRC, it was more a question of when the United Nations said apartheid is a crime against humanity, more that it impinged on moral than on legal culpability. For the TRC, the question was bigger than a legal one, as important as that was. It wasn't enough to focus on criminal culpability of isolated individuals. It wasn't enough to identify a few individuals and say, boom, into court with you. It's about systematic and systemic abuse. It's about collective abuse. It's about political structures in South Africa which result in significant sections of society being viewed as less than fully human, as being viewed as subhuman. And what that means is that those political structures condemned people to suffering and violence as a matter of daily course. And so the question which the TRC in this section deals with and ends with is, to what extent can individual South Africans be regarded as responsible for the premises and the presuppositions which gave rise to apartheid? And it says, and I agree, that this is a question which most white South Africans shy away from. White South Africans do not want to face that question. And here's what the TRC says about it. It gives an answer. It says that the kindest answer consists of a reminder that history suggests that most citizens are inclined to lemming-like behavior, thoughtless submission rather than thoughtful accountability. This is a tendency that needs to be addressed in ensuring that the future is different from the past and serves as a reminder that the most penetrating inquiry into the past requires more than a witch hunt. Yeah, I'm going to take some questions, and I was given one in advance. I feel like I should take it first, but I see hands as well, so let me start with you and then move to you, and let me just see, we have 6 minutes.
One of the statements shows that Clive said that reparations have been made where there were other commissioners.
Yeah.
Way.
So Kulamani says that reparations were made in other truth commissions. Where are those other truth commissions? And just for the sake of brevity and getting to it right at the beginning, there were 4 which are listed on the Center for Transitional Justice website: Chile, Morocco, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia. And that chart then highlights. And that's only the tip of the iceberg of the hundreds: Argentina, Bolivia, Chad. There's literally a whole range of these kinds of these kinds of things. And the clearest ones certainly are quickly those that I started with. Yes, ma'am.
How were the reparations funded? How is the South African government funded? And are there funds being allocated ongoing for reparations?
So the reparations were funded in the first instance by the state, because the state accepted the burden from the past. There was also the President's Fund, which had 970 million in, so the President had a specific fund which was hardly used.
And where did it come from?
That came from state and business and other civil society contributions.
Contributions or taxes?
And taxes. So in other words, it was a combination of tax and other contributions, and the current funding, insofar as those 30 million rands grants for those 18 communities is concerned, will be a mix of that as well. Yeah, but of course the question of funding is woefully adequate, and a question that should be addressed is, where should the funding come from? And the answer to that, of course, is multifaceted. So the question is, a key question is, how do you fund reparations? Who pays reparations? Who ought to pay reparations? What's the role of perpetrators in all of that? Is it right for the state to accept that burden, because that means everyone is in effect paying, because we all pay tax, etc.? So it's a pretty profound question, and if you were a commissioner, you would have been grappling with that too. Rich, do I have time for one more?
No, you're 5 minutes.
So I mentioned during the first class that I went into towns in South Africa, villages, towns really, to teach conflict resolution and to talk about different approaches to conflict. Who decided the need for that, and how quickly did it happen? Did the village leaders respond well? Which I read, did communities respond well? Did you see any direct results from these conflict resolution bits? And a kind thank you, which I appreciate. So civil society and government at the time recognized the need for, as we started the negotiation process, two things. One was information about the process, which needed to filter down and up. But what was happening at a national level, and secondly, the importance of local negotiation structures to enable local communities to support the peace process at a national level, which makes sense. In conflict resolution theory, you talk about multiple tracks, and a key track is the local track to support what's happening at a national level. And so these conflict resolution workshops, which I led, were part and parcel of a wider endeavor recognized by a broad range of people at the time, leaders at the time, to empower local communities, to establish negotiation forums. The impacts were amazing. There were times when I would go into a room and it would be divided between black and white, and they'd literally come into the room with their guns and were ready to go out back and protest and things like that. Febrile, volatile circumstances where once we began to use Burtonian and Fisherian and in fact, you know, many conflict resolution theorists had provided great practical approaches to dealing with conflict. Once we'd begun to work with folk, in many instances, a forum was established, which of course is a huge thing. People would exchange phone numbers, and they would have never, you know, they would eat together, black and white. We'd have lunch and stuff like that. They would have never done that. So it depends also what you mean by outcomes, and often some of the biggest outcomes were literally, you know, you're a human being. Yeah, oh right, okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean that is exactly one of the key outcomes, is to so you dehumanize the enemy in war, and then you can kill them. You wanted to break down a lot of that, and then of course empower people to realize that you can differ without resorting to violence. You can differ without resorting to name calling. You can differ without resorting to kindergarten politics. You can differ constructively, and you can engage despite differences perfectly fine and perfectly well as human beings. We did that in South Africa. We were shooting at each other and we began to engage, and that's a wonderful thing if you can achieve it and if you can sustain it, which it seems we might be struggling with right now. I'm just going to go there and then.
Just wondering, do you think that the truth would have come out, victims identified, perpetrators identified, if the perpetrators had not been given full amnesty?
No. My personal view is that amnesty played an important role in surfacing the truth, and that we would have had a long and laborious and ultimately futile series of attempts at criminal and civil litigation, which would have never got us near the amount of truth that we got because of the amnesty process. It's a high price to pay because, of course, the balance between that and reparations is so skewed. But in and of itself, And given that one of the objectives of the TRC was to elicit as full a truth as possible, I think on balance, that part was right. What wasn't right was the relationship between amnesty and reparation, and the fuller design of the TRC. So I wouldn't disagree with amnesty, and I think it was the right thing to do. Also because of the delicate nature of the political process at the time, you needed to keep that process moving. But I would say that the balance, that the equation didn't balance. Yes, ma'am.
When you went into the room where it was guns on both sides,
Yeah.
what was like the first step you did as a negotiator?
I used to start talking about the scorched earth legacy. And I used to start talking about the ash heap and the fact that the path we were on would lead to a barren, desolate, scorched earth legacy for our children. And so I would start talking about what it meant if we did what we were doing. And from there, I would begin to describe alternatives. And I would talk about the fact that we are so often focused on what we want that we forget that it's maybe more important to think about how we go about getting what we want than what we want. So we can be blinded by what we want to such an extent that we forget that if we don't go about it in the right way, we may get nothing. And then is that nothing what we want to get, and work from there. I wish I could find, because in those days I used to use an overhead projector. Do you remember those things? I tell some students when I started working, I used to use a typing pool, and the typist used to Tipex out letters, and it would take 3 days to get a letter to work. And I wish I could find those transparencies, because I used to, do a bit of stuff with the old overheating, overhead projector, which now is all digital. Yeah.
We have to make that the last question, so. Clive, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Big hand.